Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can see it.
I'm doing this on an iPad and I can't see if you can see it. So, all right, I'm going to enlarge upon my talk a little bit on my video. The coincidence number of the universe, it's another take on the idea of the anthropic principles, but it's based on observation of something other than cosmological constants. It's a property, but it's also a variable, and it accounts for a lot of strange and wonderful features of our universe, some of which I mentioned. And it can also take the place of cognition in certain instances. But coincidence supplies information. It provides information that contingency on its own just cannot. And it manifests itself, I guess, most effectively as a coordination between the internal states, physical or even mental, with the external environment. Now, there's a lot to say about coincidence in the subatomic realm, and what its role in making the universe expand, for example, perhaps even in dark matter, but I won't go there just now. But I'm going to assert that probably the most significant coincidence number at the human narrative level is going to be around about 4. And I'll talk a little bit about this later on. That picture, by the way, I couldn't think what to put there, so I just put a picture of the very first car I ever had as a student. It gives you some idea of the evolution, perhaps, of what's going on today. Anyway, coincidence enhances evolution, and that's what I'm principally going to talk about in a moment. It enhances cognition. It helps us. It gives us. It's a way in which the brain can lay down memories, and it's also negentropic. Coincidence provides information that's costless. I just want to say, I forgot to mention, I did write a book about this. It came out in March, and it covers a lot of these ideas and the ideas of progress, of SETI, transhumanism. It's trying to join the quantum realm with the human narratives about consciousness, dream, language, even about piloting interstellar ships. If anybody is interested, I can send them a link. All right. Firstly, evolution. Here, the idea of progress has come up, and I think I can give you a measure of evolutionary progress, which is the rising levels of coincidence that an organism can take advantage of. As we grow, humans, for example, are very spectacularly able to knit disparate sort of events into something and make use of it and run with the ideas that they throw up, the information. The lesser animals are not able to do this. The coincidence is free of the Markov condition. It states that causes do their job and then finish, or that all likelihoods of the child event are to be found in the parents of that event and nowhere else. Coincidence supplies information in chains of cause at no cost. As such, it's an accelerant. It's an accelerant of development. And while we may expect other universes to have different coincidence numbers and therefore different rates of acceleration of development, it may be possible, it may be likely that other regions of our universe also vary in their coincidence levels. And this would impact the evolution of life in these regions. I gave a couple of examples of the human narrative coincidence in my video, but I'd like to finish with just another story. It happened just a couple of weeks ago here. Here I'm living in the mountains, and I went down out of the house to a wooded slope in order to do some logging. While I was there, a crow flew overhead and settled somewhere in the woods. And it started cawing like mad. It went on and on and on, so much so that I stopped what I was doing and sort of went into the woods to see if I could see him, see what was going on. And he was sitting at the top of the tallest chestnut tree on the slope, making a hell of his racket. And as I looked up beyond into the sky, there was a red kite just circling lazily above. didn't seem to understand why a red kite should cause any problem to a crow. But then this hawk zoomed in across the level of the trees and went overhead. So I understood. Now, the crow and I, we don't share any symbolic language. We don't understand anything about our own respective sort of states. And yet, the coincidence and the context conveyed a lot of information to me. So it made me think about, if we're going to message extraterrestrial intelligences, we should forget about them getting into the symbols, getting into the language. We should simply transmit coincidences. I'll give you another example of what I mean. In the movie Arrival, is it the heptapods? I don't remember. The Arrival is a very good movie, but it really commits itself to the old paradigm of codes and logic, decoding, and creating symbols. Whereas in fact, if those heptapods had just sort of landed and set about making one of their own houses, and we'd seen that and started making a house, our kind of house next door, the interactions, the coincidental interactions, I'm sure would have conveyed a whole lot more information a lot more quickly than going through the traditional path. So I think if we are going to message extraterrestrial intelligences, we should just connect a radio telescope up to a Netflix subscription and just transmit documentaries one after the other endlessly on a loop. The Carl Sagan's kind of the golden record is an idea like that, but it doesn't commit to the notion of just sending contexts. A good context documentary would be, say, something like one on nuclear power, or a Greenpeace documentary on nuclear power, or on dancing or high school football, anything. The idea is that we are transmitting a lot of possible information or sources of information without giving away any diplomatic attitudes or betray weakness. We also don't need to ask questions. We just simply need to convey context and allow the miracle of coincidence to help us derive the meaning. So what is important, I think, at the end of the book that I write, of course, I take this idea of coincidence in the human narrative level a little bit further and try and describe the fact that we all of us belong to a kind of kinship of coincidence that stretches through the past and into the future. And I'm trying to suggest that many features of the future are extractable from these kinships that we have. And in fact, part of my my current work is to develop a project that I simply want to put in train, where we can explore, we can use the exploration of the inner space to find out stuff about the external outer space. So I guess I'm saying coincidences shouldn't be ignored. And I'll stop there. I don't hear anybody.
John, go ahead. Did you forget to take your hand down, John? All right, I'll call on Eric then.
So what you're talking about in terms of, I'm going to go off one thing you said in your talk video specifically, rather than trying to incorporate all the things you said just now in it. But at root in this idea of coincidence numbers is the notion that they're not somehow a necessary consequence of other aspects of physical reality. In other words, there's an assertion that's implicit in this, just like there's in the anthropic principle, that a universe could exist in which the coincidence numbers were different than what we observe today. However, in whatever you define. So, like in the anthropic principle, it's the standard model constants that they talk about, and in your system, it's the thing. But to my eye, that's a metaphysical assertion that other such things could exist. In order to be able to turn that into a scientific claim, you'd have to actually create a pocket universe illustrating the existence of such an alternate reality that had those constants to it, because otherwise we have no real experimental claim that the imagined world of a system with different constants actually is possible to exist. There's an experimental fact that's missing here that leaves these things, firmly tied in the metaphysical realm and not tied and unable to be tied in the experimental realm in any kind of imagination I can have.
Well, yes, except I think astronomically it is. We may be able to interpret some of our observations of different regions of space. At the moment, we're talking about dark energy and dark matter and, WIMPs and axions and all the rest of it. Well, we may be able to interpret these effects, observational effects, through the use of coincidence rather than necessarily posing, problems of the the energy, cosmological energy of the universe and stuff like that. But yeah, you're right. We are missing this observational data or observational interpretation of the data.
To give one example of why these questions of whether the standard model is in some sense fundamental, there's enough people who've studied religion here to understand my claim that the standard model, when it's being asserted as what causes the universe, is essentially the model of a Gnostic demiurge who's constructing the world magically by the illustration of equations. There's a very old kind of religious sensibility that Newton shared in part. That's even the mere existence of the idea called physical law presumes some kind of lawgiver, and for Newton that wasn't a problem, but for modern people it's rather more problematic. So there's one observation that's not really well known, and it's a little too far afield for people to want to deal with. But there's a experimental group that's been studying large scale homogeneity in the universe, and there's apparently a designated axis of the universe where the redshift, there's anomalous redshifts going off, and their analysis, without trying to be ontological about it, estimates a variation in the fine structure constant that's a spatial variation. There's a challenge to the notion of large scale homogeneity in the universe, and when you end up with experimental evidence that's not even completely consistent on some of what we consider basic assumptions like homogeneity, there's much more reason to believe that what we consider basic physical laws are actually manifestations of something else, and that the picture is incomplete and in fact may never be complete. Like Feynman made fun of the woman who said turtles all the way down, but frankly, I think she's got more of the actual reality of what physical modeling is going to look like, is that you're never going to end being able to create a more faithful model of what reality is like.
I agree, but I guess the word coincidence has a lot of cultural trappings to it, so it's kind of difficult to talk about it purely. But coincidence is an undoubted fact. We all experience it at the narrative level, of course, and then at the subatomic level. The great nuclear synthesis, for example, requires quite a lot of coincidences of one sort or another. It's just that we seem to think that it's just the same as contingency, but actually it's not, because the kind of coincidences, the levels of coincidence, there is either a recapitulation of information, which is in itself further information in most of the coincidences. So it's particles, let us say, particles meet once and then they meet up again. They've carried the information of their previous encounter, which makes their interaction slightly less predictable than it might have been given what we know or what we think we know, say, about the behaviors of those particles. The
predictability a feature of nature, or a feature of human analysis?
well, look, can I go to the whiteboard here for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm just going to do this very briefly. Okay. Go on. No. Oh, I'm sorry. It doesn't seem to be working for me.
I don't think that's working very well.
No, forget it. Forget it. I like to think of we think of at the quantum level superposition between two states. I actually think you can write it better as actually a matrix of 4 states, one of which includes a memory and a prediction. And I think when you think of things like that, then you can begin to understand how 2 particles interact. There's quite a lot of coincidence between different states, which may be one of the reasons why the Bell inequality works.
Well,
I agree. There's more to study.
I'd like to insert a brief kind of question here, and I should preface this by saying I watched your talk last night after a full day of conferencing, so I probably wasn't firing on all cylinders. But my reaction to this talk is a lot like my reaction to every talk I've ever been to on semiotics. It sounds interesting, but it's so abstract that I just can't figure out how to connect it up to real world issues. Now, at the end of your talk, you said, we would feel out of place on other worlds. Our perceptions may fail in important ways and not allow us to extract information. Now, that's a claim I understand, although I'd like you to give me a concrete example of what you mean so I can connect it to the rest of the stuff you talked about.
An example of a different level of coincidence. I'm not sure I can do that. It's hard to say. But, okay, do you play backgammon? Have you ever played backgammon?
Sure.
Okay, sure. Right. Well, all right. So if the different levels of coincidence, I mean, there's a term, ergodicity, right? So that the probability rates in individual elements as well as groups remain the same, permeate. Well, in a world where coincidence would be different, you would throw fewer doubles, let's say. Now that would change your behavior during the game in the backgammon if you threw fewer doubles. Well, let's say that you threw a higher number of 7s between the 2 dice, because a doubles, that's a coincidence, one double and another. All right. So now, how this would occur, obviously, it's difficult to extrapolate the effects of the small world of the backgammon table out into the biological world, but it's almost certainly the case that the coincidence that we have between, let's say, our internal development rate of alleles, which is what changes every 2 million years or something like that, and the coincidence that the alleles create with the environmental changes. If coincidence was higher, then the consequence of the alleles would accelerate the evolution of the genotype, would it not? So evolution would take place very quickly, but you'd have very many fewer variations.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, that's my timer.